for the region. And we are so fortunate that Lahav, who is here with us, was part of a delegation of journalists, and that she was actually in Dubai for with this delegation of journalists on the ground, as finding out really what was going on behind the scenes, and very much is going to give us the opportunity tonight to hear from that experience that she had. And also she has extensive experience, I'll read her bio in a moment, in Israeli politics, in Middle Eastern politics. And so she really will be able to give us the benefits, not only of her experience on this trip, but also all of the background and what this means again for these countries and also regionally and beyond. And we'll also be taking a look at some of the internal mood and dynamics within Israel right now, and what's happening on the ground in Israel. So at this point, it is my honor and pleasure to be able to introduce Lahav, who is the senior contributing editor of the Jerusalem Post. And she has been working there, analyzing and reporting on Israel's relations with the rest of the world, the Prime Minister's office, the National Security Council, the Foreign Ministry, and more. And she was also Jerusalem Post's top analyst and reporter in the Knesset for over 8 years. So that really has given her a tremendous amount of insight into internal Israeli dynamics and all of the implications of that. She has been asked by numerous organizations to lecture on Israeli government and politics. And her articles have appeared in publications including Commentary, the New York Post, Tablet, the National Interest, Tower, and the Jewish Week. Lahav made Aliyah at the age of 17. She grew up in New Jersey, and she did Sherut Leumi, a national service working with museums on Jewish and Israeli history. She has a degree in political science and communications from Bar Ilan, lives in Tel Aviv with her husband and 2 children. And I will say that when I was asking colleagues and friends of mine, who can we have come and speak about these extraordinary new developments, who would give an unusual perspective and would be able to bring the benefits of larger perspective on Israel and on the Middle East. Really, Lahav's name came right to the top of that list. And so I reached out, and she was gracious enough to agree to come here. So Lahav, thank you so much for being.
Thanks so much for having me.
And welcome to you. So I would like to begin. So many of us, of course, have read just about the normalization agreements, trying to understand what this means for Israel, what this means in the broader context. And you were part of this delegation of journalists. You wrote about it, and you have reflected about it. So I would like you to just start by sharing with us really some of the highlights of your trip, what it is that you noted in terms of the society of UAE in Dubai on the ground, and your takeaway from why you think this country, its leadership, and its people are so interested in normalization and even peace with Israel. So please share your experiences with us.
Well, I mean, for starters, I'll give a little background and context on the trip. This was the first ever official Israeli delegation to the United Arab Emirates. We were going to Abu Dhabi for just a little over a day. And the delegation was led by the head of Israel's National Security Council, Meir Ben Shabbat. And this was, 2 weeks after, or about 2 weeks after peace with the UAE was announced. And just to start out, the fact of the trip was something that was so exciting and so emotional, I think, for a lot of people. That we were making peace with another Arab country for the first time in 26 years. That this was a country that wanted to host Israeli delegations and wanted Israelis to come and to meet Israelis and to speak to Israelis and to learn more. So even, as we were just taking off on the first ever direct flight from Israel to the United Arab Emirates, or the first commercial flight, since there have been some secret private flights and things like that. And the pilot, you got over the loudspeaker and talked about how it was a historic moment. Just that was exciting. And within, the first hour when the pilot was announcing, by the way, we're crossing into Saudi airspace, and it was the first time an Israeli flight was allowed to do that. It's like, as a journalist, like, we're so trained and sort of honed on criticism and trying to look for, what's the story between the lines here. But this was something that I felt was really purely positive and exciting. And I don't think it was just me. I think most of the people on that plane saw this as like, wow, history is happening, and this is something that's good for Israel. And we can get into the details, and the people can say different things about it, but on that level, it was just so exciting. Once we were there and we met people, it was also an interesting experience. I mean, it's a very different country and a very different society from Israel. People may not know that 88% of the population of the United Arab Emirates are not actually citizens. So there's a large number of foreigners, whether they're domestic workers or other sort of blue collar type jobs, or there's a lot of sort of very wealthy businessmen from all over the world, or business people, I should say, from all over the world, mainly in Dubai, less so in Abu Dhabi, which is the capital and the seat of government, whereas Dubai is sort of the business capital. And we were in Abu Dhabi because these were government meetings. So we didn't get a lot of exposure to that, sort of to the non-citizen population, a little bit in the hotel, people working in the hotel and things like that, but people there were sort of pretty cautious. But we did get to talk to actual Emiratis, and it was a very interesting experience. Look, it's not a democracy, right? And so they weren't used to
Sure.
our level of Israeli chutzpah that we really wanted to poke our heads into everything. We wanted to know what was going on all the time in all the rooms with the government officials, and the Emiratis were not so happy about that. And our quote unquote minders were actually from the American government and not Israeli government, because it was the US Embassy in Israel that actually arranged this for the journalists. Whereas usually when we travel, it's with the Prime Minister's office. And on a plane with the Prime Minister, but of course Netanyahu wasn't actually on this trip. So our American minders kept reminding us to be polite, which we all found very funny. Like, as if we Israelis are, so, all right, we have Israeli chutzpah, but we know how to behave. But our Emirati hosts arranged a dinner for us where we got to meet people from the government, and also people, also journalists and people who work in different cultural institutions. And I got to sit at dinner and speak to people sort of in an unscripted way and hear what people thought. And I was very impressed sort of by the level of knowledge people had about Israel, and also that a lot of people had studied abroad and had met Israelis and had Israeli friends, and they were just excited on that person-to-person level to be able to have a better relationship with these people. They wanted to come to Israel. I got into a whole conversation with someone about hiking in Israel, about the Israel Trail, if you're familiar, hiking across Israel and what that's like. And just little things like that, which I think is what makes this piece with the UAE so different from, say, Jordan or Egypt, where the population is not so interested in Israel. In Jordan, several times a year, you have like resolutions by the parliament to not have peace with Israel anymore, and things like that. Whereas this feels like it's a real warm peace with the population. The caveat being that, the citizens, the Emiratis, as opposed to the broader population of residents there, where, it could be mixed in any way.
Right, sure. So were there moments that you found to be surprising? I mean, you've never been there before. It is a very, very different place. Anything that you did not expect? I mean, other than what you described, which was that very warm welcome, but was there anything that really struck you?
Well, you see this, and I didn't know this yet because it was 2 weeks before that, but in the text of the Abraham Accords themselves, you see a lot of references to sort of interfaith tolerance and cooperation. And I saw that in the UAE itself. One of the places where they took the delegation was the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. There's like a smaller Louvre. And one of the sort of exhibits there, part of the emphasis of their Louvre is religious art. And you would think that, it's a fairly conservative Muslim country, that, first of all, I wasn't expecting them to have images of people, because that goes against sort of the stricter interpretation of Islam, which they definitely did. But they had art from all different religions, and they made a point of it, that they had, illuminated sort of Torah texts, not like a Sefer Torah, but like, Torah texts and Jewish art together with Muslim art and Christian art. And they're sort of building this, and this was in the news before there was peace between Israel and the UAE, but they're building this complex, the like Abrahamic complex, where they're going to have a church, a mosque, and a synagogue. And I felt that they are really emphasizing this interfaith thing as a sort of a path to peace and a path to combating extremism in the Middle East. And I thought that was a very interesting message that they were trying to send.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it seems that the UAE, even going back decades, has been trying to send the message that they want to promulgate an approach to Islam that is less extreme, that is more moderate. And it seems that you're seeing that as well, which is certainly very uplifting. Of course, one could also say that the warmth of the peace might also be reflective of the physical distance. These are not two countries that have ever been firing on each other, for example, or have ever been involved in a war, and that's certainly something that we could take up later. I mean, also, I'll just reflect. It's funny, when I was involved in doing interfaith work with a group of Christian clergy. So before we got together, we, the rabbis, were told, don't talk too much. They must have said that over and over, don't talk too much, let them talk. So that's sort of the experience that you had, being told, as an Israeli, don't ask too many questions. But we also managed to behave ourselves during that conversation. And I would like for you now, if you would, to reflect, because you also had a front row seat in Washington at the ceremony that took place at the White House, and that also was something that was remarkable in so many ways. So please, whatever you feel comfortable sharing about that, we'd love to hear.
I mean, it's funny you call it a front row seat. I was very concerned about social distancing, so I would say it was maybe, if we're talking about theater equivalents, it was like a box seat. I was a little off to the side.
Mezzanine,
Right, exactly. I had a luxury that my colleagues who are in television or radio didn't have, which is that I didn't actually have to be in the front row, to do my job. So I was able to be a little more distant. But in any case, it was also a very exciting moment. Clearly they staged it in a way, they set it up in a way to be reminiscent of when Oslo was signed. But I think it's just like it's a big contrast. I think that there's just so much optimism in Israel. I mean, in Oslo, there was optimism in Israel, but at the same time, you had, close to half the population that was very angry and upset about it. Whereas in Israel, I think people are overwhelmingly happy about this. And again, you're right. It's just a very different situation of, these are people who we didn't actually fight a war with, but I still think it's a big deal, which I can get into more about after. But, I was very excited at the ceremony. I think it was very interesting to see, for me, as someone who grew up in the US, it was interesting and I guess not surprising, because I know about the Trump administration. I know who they're talking to on these issues, but there were so many kippot in the audience, that you felt like the Jewish community had a really big input in this, and a lot of different major Jewish organizations have been very involved in interfaith efforts in Gulf states, but I think that that's really helped push this along in some ways. And so it felt, for me, as someone who's like an Israeli American Jew, that this was a celebration of Israeli Jews and American Jews in a way that you don't always see it. I found that very exciting. And to hear speeches, I mean, again, that these are people who are excited to make peace with one another, excited to cooperate with one another, and that they had this message that there can be peace between Israel and Arab states, even if some of the other factors in the region, Palestinians and others, don't want to be part of it. We don't have to wait for everyone to buy in before we can start progressing, and having a more peaceful region.
Right. I understood, by the way, that there was a mincha on the White House lawn that took place.
Yes, I missed that because I was in what's called the pool, which is like a small group of reporters who are allowed into, say, a room where not everyone can go in. So I was in the pool for the lunch meeting of Netanyahu, Trump, and the Bahraini and UAE foreign minister. So I had to leave right away, but I saw the same pictures everyone else saw of the mincha minyan at the end of the ceremony.
Wow. So I would like to follow up on that.
Mhm.
So, okay, you weren't at Mincha, but could you say
Yeah.
a
I
little
was in
bit
the
about
Oval
what
Office, so
your,
that was interesting.
oh, okay. Okay. So I mean, just a little bit
Yeah.
about your role, because you said you had a specific role that didn't require you to be right up front. So if you could just sort of clarify for all of us what your
Oh,
specific
well,
role was, and also, and really what you observed from your particular, what were you looking for? And what did you observe that we might not have been able to observe just watching it on social media or television?
well, what I meant about my specific role is that I'm a print journalist. I mean, it's also online, but it's, my journalism is written, so I didn't have to stand in front of a camera. I didn't have to
Sure.
hold up a microphone to someone. So I was able to, during the speeches, during the center of the main part of the ceremony itself, to socially distance in a safe way,
Got it. Okay.
and sit and take my notes, rather than, being standing right by the camera in front and
Right.
in the crowds. But of course, I also went up to people and I asked people how they were feeling and what they thought of it, and sort of people who were more involved in the policy side, sort of deeper questions about things like that.
Right. Right. So could you share just some, so you're talking about American officials that you were interviewing primarily, other Israeli or UAE officials? Who are you talking to?
At the ceremony itself, I'll be honest, there were not a lot of opportunities to really interview. It was like a question here, question there. My Secretary of State Pompeo walked by a group of us Israeli journalists, so we asked him a couple questions. I can't say that he said anything too in-depth or surprising at the event itself, because it's just a bunch of people, throwing a microphone in his face.
Sure.
In the Oval Office, I thought President Trump said some interesting things. I think that was the first time that he had said that he thought that there might be 5 more countries on the way. Which I'm not sure. I mean, soon after, some officials from the Palestinian Authority had listed 5 countries that they thought were on the way. Some people interpreted the Palestinian Authority intentionally named countries that are sort of like, not a lot of people have heard of them, in order to sort of belittle the whole process. Either way, there are talks going on in a lot of different places. Sudan being a big one right now. I know the Trump administration really wants Saudi Arabia to come on board, but I'll be very surprised if that happens before the election, certainly. I think they have play a certain role in the region, a certain leadership role, and they also have Mecca and Medina in their country, that there would have to be a greater change of public opinion throughout the region, I think, before they'd be willing to do that, or a generational shift where King Salman has a much more traditional stance vis-a-vis the Palestinians, as opposed to, MBS, his son, the Crown Prince, who is much more enthusiastic about Israel. So that's something that I think will wait. But it is possible that Sudan will do it. There's a lot of talk about that right now, and some smaller Muslim states in Africa.
Interesting. And Bahrain, I mean, was that something that was surprising?
Yeah, I mean, Bahrain was part of, you're right, I barely mentioned Bahrain. It's mainly UAE. I think, I think it's funny. I think it has a lot to do with their sort of social media presence. Bahrain is like the UAE is this like very international kind of place. They have a lot of international business going on there, and Bahrain is a lot less so. And so they have a lot less of a sort of media presence and media outreach that they do. So they also have they're a Sunni king and a mostly Shiite population. And so there is some tension there. When I talk about the warmth and the population being excited, it applies a lot more to UAE than Bahrain, even though there are business opportunities and things being discussed in Bahrain as well.
Okay. So now, of course, there is also a realpolitik side to this. In addition, right? There isn't. I mean, the fact that there are people in the UAE who are interested and know about Israel and are curious about Israel is beautiful, and certainly. From the perspective of Israelis, to be recognized as kind of a bit more of a normal country, and to have some of their connections with UAE be able to be more boldly demonstrated. Things have been going on for years, but now, offices for, cooperation. I mean, I understand there was an office on, having to do with energy resources, for example, that operated under the radar, right? And now it's open. So that's all. No, go ahead. That's.
No, it's just an interesting sort of technical thing, is that the UN's renewable energy agency was based in Abu Dhabi. So they allowed Israel, I think this was 4 years ago, they allowed Israel to open an office within that UN sort of compound. So it was an embassy to the UN renewable energy and not an embassy to Abu Dhabi. But it's all these things where, you know, they're slowly opening themselves up to Israel in an unofficial way. And then now this sort of big thing came along. But I want to respond to something that, if you don't mind, that I touched on a couple times, which is that we've never been at war with the UAE and Bahrain. So some people say this is not really a peace treaty. And I would dispute that. I mean, no, we've not been at war with them, but they are part of the Arab League, which is an institution that said it will not recognize Israel. I mean, for a long time, it said no negotiations with Israel, no recognition, right? No peace. And Egypt and Jordan were the pioneers. I mean, Egypt was really the pioneer, and you know, Sadat really lost his life over it. You know, and they took a very brave step when those 3 no's were still very fresh and new. But I still think that as, you know, members in good standing of the Arab League, and, you know, who signed on also to the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which also said that normalization will only come after peace with the Palestinians under terms that are not so friendly to Israel. It is a big deal, and I would consider it peace because they were part of a hostile group of countries. What I think is even more amazing is what's happened in the Arab League in the past couple of weeks, which is that the Palestinians pushed for the Arab League to condemn this normalization with Israel and peace with Israel. And the Arab League refused. And then the Palestinians who held that, there's like a rotating presidentship. So the Palestinians held the rotating presidentship this month, and they quit in anger. And I think that that's very interesting. I think it's a sort of rebuke from the Arab League to the Palestinians, saying to them, maybe you need to get with the program.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. I mean, it is an incredible paradigm shift, because we all believed, I mean, and certainly, you know, those of us who have been following this, that was a criterion that was non-negotiable. I mean, that just satisfying Palestinian demands, negotiations, et cetera, was a non-negotiable criterion for moving forward. And this just breaks that paradigm, which is why I think so many people who, as you say, are often cynical, are actually hopeful that this might represent some kind of a breakthrough. So what I'd love to explore with you now is the whole question of leadership, and to take a look really at the role that the various leaders of the United States, of Israel, of the UAE have played. Because, I mean, you'll hear people say, I suppose, depending on their overarching perspective about these leaders and about these matters, everything ranging from, you know, these developments were underway and they really would have reached fruition no matter what, to these were the right leaders at the right time, and they acted in ways that very deliberately moved the process forward. So I would just love to hear your perspective, speaking about American leadership, speaking about Netanyahu, and also the UAE leadership. So please share that with us.
Yeah, I mean, if you're familiar with the internet meme where people say, thanks, Obama, sarcastically. So I don't know, maybe not sarcastically, but in some ways the Obama administration did, you know, unwittingly throw Israel and the UAE and other Gulf states together, because these are all countries that oppose the Obama administration's policies on Iran so much that, you know, countries that had very little to do with each other started really talking to each other because they all felt the same threat, and they all felt that Iran was being empowered in some ways by the Iran deal. So we start with those leaders. To touch on something much less controversial, I think, Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ, the Crown Prince of the Emirates, he's the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi is his technical title, but he's the leader of the Emirates. I think he did something very courageous here, and I think he deserves full credit. And I think everyone gives him credit for that, really, you know, except for maybe, you know, Khamenei in Iran, but we have no expectations from him. So MBZ, you know, he did something to shift the paradigm, right? He really did something that was courageous, that was new in the Middle East, and he deserves full credit for that. And I think that that was good leadership, because he looked at this and he saw only good could come of it. You know, the fact that some people might be disappointed in him, you know, at the end of the day, I think for his country, it's only better. It only expands its business horizons. It only helps its national security. To move on to, Netanyahu and Trump, who are both sort of figures, both in Israel and the US, where, people love them or hate them, kind of. I think Netanyahu overall, this is it's definitely a strong support for his longstanding thesis, which he wrote in his book. He had a book called A Place Among the Nations that came out in 1995, and I read it for a project that I'm working on these days. And it's amazing how prescient he was in that book. And you look at Netanyahu and you think, he just has ideas and he's working at them, but in a way he had laid out a sort of doctrine, the way he thought Israel should be, and he really followed it. And that doctrine in a way is that Israel must build itself up from the inside to be a strong country and to be sort of an indispensable country. And then other countries will want partnerships with Israel. That it's rather than the idea of Israel needs to make concessions and then other countries will come to us. Israel needs to be strong and other countries will come to us. And I would say that doesn't necessarily, mean Netanyahu wouldn't make any concessions. He did agree to some kind of Palestinian state in the terms of the Trump peace deal, which now looks, I don't know that that's going to go anywhere, but he did agree to that. But in general, his idea was, we build up Israel's economy, we continue to have a strong army, and countries will want to come to us and work with us. And I really think it's true. I mean, I think it's worked out in many places around the world, but I think that with the UAE, that's, the biggest, the biggest sea change, sort of, where they're both very interested in Israeli technology and Israel's economy, and they're interested in Israel as a security powerhouse. They're interested in working together with Israel on security issues and against Iran. So, I think that Netanyahu's leadership is very strong here. And with President Trump, I think that, like him or not, you could definitely say that he looks at things in a different way than his predecessors did. And really, I don't think people highlighted it over the past 4 years, myself included. Like, it was something that I barely noticed. But all along, people in the Trump administration had been saying that other countries in the region could and should make peace with Israel. And I actually started looking back a bit. I looked at the speech when President Trump presented his peace plan back in January, and he mentioned it. And then Jared Kushner mentioned it in interviews on TV in the subsequent days. I interviewed Jason Greenblatt, who was Trump's envoy, who basically wrote his peace plan. And he had also said, these countries, they can't go on pretending they don't have relations with Israel anymore. It doesn't make any sense. And they've really emphasized this, and they basically refuse to accept the sort of common wisdom about the region and really wanted to look at things differently. And in some ways it's Trump's, business deal maker sort of way of looking at things, where he just sort of said, how does this help your bottom line? It's not an ideological thing. Like, look at the bottom line. You want to help your country's economy, you want to help your country's security. Why does pretending Israel doesn't exist help that? And so I do think that it was an act of leadership in all three countries, that helped bring this together, each in its own way.
No, thank you. Thank you. I mean, I just some follow-up questions. I mean, first of all, at least my understanding was that the leadership of the UAE was interested in the United States loosening certain restrictions on arms sales, so that was part of the deal and part of the conversation. So which is a very specific thing that the United States was willing to do, and if you could also address Netanyahu's reaction to that, that would be helpful. And the other thing also, I'm curious to understand your perspective on, Netanyahu was very interested in annexation, and that was something which evolved for him out of the Trump plan, but he was willing to table it for the time being. And so what kind of a price was that for him to pay politically? So if you could just address some of those, interesting dimensions that I, and I'm sure others have been wondering about.
Sure. So I'll start the issue of F-35s. There's other sort of, advanced weaponry being discussed as well. On all sides, Israel, UAE, and the US, everybody says that this was not part of the deal between the UAE and Israel. Netanyahu says it. When I was in the UAE, officials there confirmed it. And so, in that sense, I believe that it was not actually part of the deal, at least not between Israel and the UAE. And Israel opposes it. Now, could it be something that the US and the UAE discussed leaving Israel out? It's possible. It doesn't match the pattern of how this administration and Netanyahu's government have worked very well together over the years. But either way, the UAE has wanted the F-35 for years. It's not a new request from them, that they made. And my understanding is that they offered to make normalization happen in the context of the Trump peace plan and Israel wanting to apply sovereignty to parts of Judea and Samaria, and not in the context of the F-35s, but they never, rescinded that request that they had been making for years. And now it's true, the Trump administration wants to push it through because they feel like if they have peace with Israel, then why would it be a threat for them to have F-35s? And opinions differ about it. It's possible that they may end up getting a sort of lower level of F-35, with less of the technological upgrades. I'm really not an expert on what those upgrades might be, but I know that there are sort of different levels of the jets that you can get. It's also a process that'll take years. It needs approval in Congress. I think it will be a bumpy road in Congress. I've seen a bunch of sort of pro-Israel Democrats like Debbie Wasserman Schultz. There's also this George Meeks, maybe Gregory Meeks, something with a G, who's running to be the new chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and who wants to replace Elliot Engel in the Foreign Relations Committee. So so I think that that's going to be an uphill battle for the UAE, and I don't think that story's over. Could that be one of many considerations that they had when pushing forward with this deal? Yes. I mean, I'm sure it was, but I just don't think it was the main impetus. I just think when you look at the bigger picture, I don't think that it's about the F-35s. Right. I think in some ways people are emphasizing it because, like I said, as journalists, we always sort of look for what's between the lines here. And, sometimes it's hard to have a story that this was just like, hey, look at this great thing. Journalists are party poopers sometimes.
Right. It can also be a lot of fun too, for the record,
Right.
There is that. So in terms of Netanyahu pulling away from annexation is one of the criteria for this to move forward.
Yeah.
First of all, to what extent has he really pulled back from annexation, and what do you think will be the repercussions for him politically right now?
I'll give you a classic politician's answer, which is that that's not the right question. That's the classic politician answer in Israel, at least when you interview them. They're like, your question should be this. So I'll say,
tell me what the question should be.
I think the question was to what extent did Netanyahu really plan to apply sovereignty, and not to what extent is he willing to abandon it now. Netanyahu has always been, when it comes to security type things, he's been very status quo. He's not someone who has made very big moves in either direction when it comes to sort of making war or making peace generally. And a lot of people doubted that Netanyahu was actually going to take this step, even though he said he was a lot of times. Now, I think he was willing to start moving towards it, but I think the minute that there was even an ounce of hesitation coming from the White House, and that hesitation came pretty fast, I would say. It came kind of the day after they presented their plan, which is a little crazy when you think about it, because they presented a plan that said Israel can do X. And then the next day, Jared Kushner got on CNN with Christiane Amanpour and was like, we're not going to do X so soon. So Netanyahu sort of got caught in this weird situation where, again, they presented this plan that said one thing, and then on TV in front of the world, they're saying another thing. And it got very messy very fast. So, I think that had the Trump administration sort of continued to stand behind its plan very strongly, and also had Netanyahu not ended up having to form a unity government in Israel, the fact that he didn't have a purely right-wing government, both of those things really contributed to the fact that he didn't get very far on that path. Everyone was sort of talking about there was this July 1st deadline, which it was the opposite. July 1st wasn't actually a deadline. It was the first date on which he would be able to bring it to a vote. And everyone just thought like July 1 was going to come, and then that was it. Like you were going to have this huge thing happen. But they really didn't get very far in the process, headphones falling out. They didn't really get very far in the process. You know, they were supposed to create a detailed map of exactly where Israel's border was going to lie, and they never really did that because of all of these other things going on. And you talked also about Israeli public opinion. So that was also an interesting factor, and I think it influenced the Trump administration when it came to them sort of hesitating to support, again, sort of their own proposal, but supporting it actually happen so soon, which is, at first, you know, this is, the plan was written with very close cooperation with people who are very close to Netanyahu, who really understood what Netanyahu wanted or what Netanyahu envisioned as what would be a safe future for Israel. But once, you know, Netanyahu went through 3 elections that he was unable to form a right-wing coalition, and he had to form this unity coalition with the Blue and White Party, which is more centrist, and right. Parts of it lean to the left and parts of it lean a little more to the right. So they're this sort of centrist mix. You know, there was that. And then there was the far right that actually was really, really angry about the plan because Netanyahu did agree to the establishment of a form of a Palestinian state. It would be a demilitarized Palestinian state. It would be a very weak Palestinian state, but Netanyahu did agree to it. And he did agree to what the Trump administration calls a conceptual map. So it's not a very detailed map, but it is the first time that an Israeli prime minister agreed to a map of what the Palestinian state would look like. And so the figures to Netanyahu's right actually didn't like the plan. The left obviously didn't like the plan because the settlements get to stay intact. In the center, the position in Blue and White was, this is a good plan if we take it as a complete plan all at once, and not if we take the first step unilaterally and then hope the Palestinians catch up. That it should only be taken as everything happening together. And so I think the Trump administration looks around and said, well, who does support this plan? You know? And polling was mixed too. I can't say that there's very consistent polling on what Israelis would want to do. As always, it depends how the questions are asked in the poll as well.
Sure.
So it was, you know, I think all of these factors contributed to delaying anything from actually happening. And then when we got close to that July 1st date, we had the op-ed written by the UAE ambassador to the US, Yusuf Al-Otaiba. He wrote an op-ed in Yediot Ahronoth, one of the most read papers in Israel, very heavily hinting that the UAE could normalize ties with Israel soon, but not if Israel took that step. Right. And that started a lot, like a flurry of activity. And I think the Trump administration saw it as a clear victory, as opposed to Israeli sovereignty moves, which would be highly controversial. They felt like this was something that they could easily come and say, Trump is a peacemaker, you know, and that there's very little downside to it. And they shifted their focus to that entirely. And at that point, Netanyahu really had no choice, because he's not going to make those moves without support from the White House. Right. He never has, and there's no reason that he would do it now.
Absolutely. It is really fascinating, though, that the impetus came from this country that, I mean, while it had connections to Israel, was really a third or a fourth party, and ended up shifting the dynamic in this way. I do want to get your perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian process, let's call it. You know, there's a Broadway show tune that was written by Sondheim called "We're Still Here." You know, I'm still here. So I mean, Palestinian leadership are saying, okay, we're upset about this. You know, this you're perhaps there is a shifting paradigm, not sure, and yet we're still here, right? And Israel certainly understands that that it's very important for some agreement to be reached. This is a people that are not a plane ride away, but you know, a border away. So could you just say a little bit about your perspective, both from the perspective of the Israeli government, which, I mean, you I think quite effectively articulated just all of the unrest in terms of, you know, which direction it's leaning with each passing election, but also Palestinian leadership. I mean, with you have somebody who's in control who is not likely, shall we say, to be open to paradigm shifts, but maybe his successors will be. So could you just address Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conversation, and where you might see it moving forward, particularly in the aftermath of these events?
Like at this point, the Palestinian-Israeli conversation is barely happening.
Right. Barely
The
audible.
right. The
Right.
Palestinians suspended cooperation with Israel before anything actually happened, just when Israel was talking about following through the Trump plan. And there is some cooperation that is actually happening, but a lot of it is still suspended. They're very angry about this. They've come out against it. You know, I talked about it in the Arab League. They didn't want to accept, even before peace was announced, they didn't want to accept aid from the UAE because the UAE sent a plane full of medical aid and had it land in Ben Gurion Airport. And they said, no, that's too close to normalization. We don't want it. And you really see this across the board of Palestinian leadership. They are saying terrible things about the UAE. They're saying these are people who only care about money and not principles and not, you know, their Arab brotherhood and things like that. Bizarrely, you hear some people in Europe reflecting that. It's like they want to be more Arab nationalist than the average Arab. It's very strange. So it's hard to see a lot of hope in those messages coming from the Palestinians. You know, but an interesting sort of political thing that's happening in the Palestinian Authority is, so the former head of Fatah in Gaza, his name is Dakhlan, Mohammed Dakhlan. He, of course, had to run away when Hamas took over Gaza. And then Abbas, you know, Palestinian Authority President Abbas saw him as a threat to his leadership. And so he had to run away again. And he's been living in Abu Dhabi and has been very close to the leader of Abu Dhabi and is considered a close advisor to him. And Palestinians have been accusing him of orchestrating this whole thing. Now, I have to say, I kind of believe that he might have orchestrated that flight of aid that landed in Ben Gurion Airport as a way to make Abbas look bad. Okay. Because the Palestinians are like, we need this medical aid and you're not letting us have it because you want to make a political stand. It's hard for me to believe that he orchestrated the entire peace thing. But to me, look, a lot of the Palestinian leadership are terrorists or former terrorists, and Dakhlan is among them. So I'm not going to, you know, maybe it's not, I'm not going to try to beautify it or whatever, but it gives me a little bit of hope that maybe he's someone who's more reasonable to work with in the future if he comes back and is popular, and he is still considered a popular figure on the Palestinian street. But overall, I mean, I think there's going to be a pretty big leadership vacuum when Abbas leaves. Not that he's some amazing, great leader. And somebody who's sort of rising as a possible leader is someone whose name is Mohammed Stein, who's the Palestinian prime minister. And he's just been seen as sort of the most capable leader in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic among Palestinians. Very, very domestic issue, but as people often forget with Israel and the Palestinians, people have their everyday life issues too, and they want leaders who can help with that. But he's not had anything positive to say about the UAE thing either.
Sure. I mean, also somebody that spoke to us recently on condition of not being quoted in his name, but said that in terms of a narrative, Palestinian leadership has been so accustomed to speaking about their victimhood as a major part of their identity. And this individual feels that the younger generation of Palestinians is actually starting to claim and to celebrate other aspects of identity and might actually be able possibly to move in the direction where everything is not primarily filtered through this sense of what it means to be victim. So perhaps,
I mean, that would be great. That would be really great. I mean, I certainly don't think Israeli identity is filtered through victimhood. I think Israeli identity is the opposite of that. Israeli identity is we don't want to be victims anymore, and so we're going to take control of our own destinies. And it would be nice for the Palestinians to have an identity like that as well. But when you look at their
right now, things are
you look at their textbooks, you look at their TV programs, those aren't the messages that they're sending. And I hope, I mean, we're talking about the younger generation, we have the whole internet, and people aren't only seeing the messages that the government allows them to see. The Palestinian Authority certainly makes a lot of attempts at censorship, but they're not the most successful at it. So maybe that'll help.
Right. Well, I want to ask you, not in the spirit of nibuah, of prophecy, which is beyond both of our pay grades, but just to try
Only given
to.
to fools these days.
Exactly right, exactly right. But I would love for you to comment a little bit, looking forward to the United States election, and what do you see as being the trajectory of some of these issues? So this particular agreement, the Iran nuclear agreement, and the alignments within the Middle East, the nations that you mentioned might possibly be on board for normalization with Israel under another Trump administration as compared with under a Biden administration. I mean, I'm sure that Israel's leadership is very carefully trying to assess how they might position themselves for one or for the other. So could you reflect on that, please?
I mean, I also personally am not, a partisan figure. And so I'm going to try not to come down in favor of one side or another. I would say for starters that I don't think either side needs to be so hysterical over either person when it comes to Israel specifically. Whatever, there are other issues. I'm not going to get involved in American domestic issues. But when it comes to Israel, I think we will be safe with either candidate, just as a baseline. I think, President Trump has had a very good track record on Israel. There maybe have been some other moves he's made in the Middle East that were more of a concern for Israel, like his hasty pullout from Syria. But, that's one out of many, many things that I think Israelis, and most Israelis, not just Netanyahu, have seen as favorable, whether it's recognizing the Golan, recognizing Jerusalem, declaring that settlements are not illegal per se, which has certainly been the legal position of Israeli governments since 1967. Or actually, it was only in the early 70s when there started being settlements. But that's labor governments too have said that, and labor governments have approved settlements. So these are all things that are fairly broad consensus in Israel, and Israelis like that Trump did that, which is part of why Trump has one of the highest public opinion ratings in the world in Israel. I believe it was the highest, although that was a couple of years ago. I'm not sure I've seen an updated thing, but I think it's because Israelis are thinking about what Trump's done for Israel, right? I know a lot of American Jews say, how could that be? When you look at what Trump's, Israel policies, they fit with the views of the vast majority of Israelis. And so I imagine he'll continue in that vein. I think Trump is very happy with this peacemaker role that he's been thrown into in the past couple months now. And I imagine that he'll continue pushing for those things. The way they're pushing on Sudan, for example, Sudan wants to be taken off of the state sponsors of terror list ever since. This is something that I've realized not a lot of people know. So I'll give a little context, which is that the dictator Omar al-Bashir, who perpetrated the genocide in Darfur, he was overthrown a year and a half ago. And they have a transitional government, and they're trying to move towards democracy there, which I think is great news in general. Now, one of the things they want is to be taken off the state sponsor of terror list in the US because it's stopping them from receiving economic aid that they very much need because they are a very poor country. The Trump administration right now is trying to pressure them to recognize Israel, to normalize ties with Israel as part of their economic aid package. I think we would see more of that kind of thing from the Trump administration if he's reelected. Trump has talked about renegotiating a deal with Iran. If I had to guess, Iran would not agree to negotiate him, and we would see more sanctions on Iran. Sort of more of the same. I'm not really sure that Trump would go back to his peace plan, even though the language of the agreement with the UAE says that it was suspended and not, completely shelved. I'm not sure that Trump would want to take that risk on a second term when he doesn't have to appeal to anyone for re-election and things like that. I'm not sure. It's hard to say. He's not the most predictable person, to be honest. When we're talking about Biden, I think he had a very positive response to peace between Israel and the UAE, and it was a much more positive response than a lot of other Obama administration alumni that worked in foreign policy that once they stopped working for President Obama, actually have said some really anti-Israel things that I found maybe not surprising, but sort of like it seemed to me like they were holding back, and now they're not in office anymore. They can say these things. So Some people have talked about concerns that those kinds of people might be in a Biden administration. Maybe, maybe not. I think that the people who turned out to be sort of the most progressive in the Obama administration are not the people who are so pro-Biden right now. So I'm maybe a little less worried about that. The sort of general where people criticize Obama alumni for saying things about Israel, I think that Biden is relatively moderate. I think that when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians, there might be some level of pressure on Israel. Certainly, they won't be going with the Trump peace plan. But I don't know that it's something that will be such a focus. I mean, I think that when you look at what's happening in the region, it's not the quote unquote linkage theory where if you solve the Israeli and Palestinian problem, all the other problems, all of the other cards will fall into place in the Middle East. I mean, it just seems so clearly not true. And I can't imagine that we're going to have another administration who will sort of follow, on that theory. And again, Biden was very positive about the peace between Israel and the UAE. So I imagine that, I'm hopeful that he'll see that as an opportunity. I don't know if he'll go with the same methods as the Trump administration, like what they're doing in Sudan now. Yeah. But I think that, that they'll see that there's an opportunity there. When it comes to Iran, it's hard to see that you could turn back time and completely bring back the Iran deal, but I think that Biden might try to bring back what he could.
Yeah.
And that's more
or possibly renegotiate also. The
deal is kind of dead at this point, right? Like America pulled out. Now there's, attempts at further sanctions, and it's this like weird limbo situation. So
right.
I don't think any American president would just be like, take me back, please. Right. I don't think that any American president's just going to come back to the deal as it stands. So I think there'll have to be some kind of renegotiation because nobody wants to make America look weak in that way. Sure. The question is, what kind of renegotiation will it be? And is it a renegotiation that will allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon in 10 years, which is what the original JCPOA could have allowed, which was a huge concern for Israel. Yeah. And so there's potential there for some kind of clash.
Right. But you would say that on balance, overall, Israelis are not mortally fearful of either outcome, the way that they might have been of certain outcomes. Somebody wrote in a question, by the way, Lahab, do you think under a Biden presidency, I think that the sense of this question is, will more Arab countries continue toward normalization with Israel? Could you imagine that happening?
Right, I saw that question. I tried to address it a little bit. I think it depends on a few other things. I think it depends on a few other factors. I don't think that Biden subscribes to former President Obama's idea that who had sort of an organizing principle for the Middle East around Iran, that Iran was the rising power and that US foreign policy has to adjust to that change. I don't think that that's where Biden is, and which is why I think that he could try to continue to encourage more Arab countries, specifically Gulf states, to get closer to Israel. But I also don't think that it's Biden's style to pressure them the way the Trump administration is pressuring them. So, I think there could be progress. I think it will come in a different way.
Right. Okay. No, thank you. So would you see the other question as well. Could you please address that? I'll read it. Can you speak about any specific business or academic joint projects between Israel and the UAE or Bahrain that are now in discussion as a result of these treaties?
It's always when someone asks me to list specific things that my mind completely blanks. The one thing I can think
but
of
conceptually even.
Yeah, there were representatives of Bank Hapoalim who went to Dubai pretty soon after the government delegation to Abu Dhabi. So there's some talk about that in finance. And I did hear about something academic, and I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, but it was something scientific related, and I'm having trouble remembering specific things. There are some startups, some tech companies that have already talked about negotiations and talking, these things happen. You don't necessarily, I guess you could make a business deal in a few weeks, but if it's a big business deal, it usually doesn't happen that fast.
Right.
I mean, there's some like more trivial things, which is that like an Israeli model came and did a photo shoot with a model in the Emirates, and things like that. But those are sort of less indicative, and if anything.
Okay.
So
No, it's still, it's something which
something.
Absolutely, and it has
We're
symbolic
like in
significance.
pajamas in the desert.
Right.
So,
No, it has symbolic significance. I mean, look, I wanted to just take us to talk a little bit more about the matzav ruach, about the mood in Israel. I mean, clearly, so much of this, you dig deeper, and some of the countries that Israel is normalizing with, I mean, do have a connection themselves to terrorism, and it's certainly Saudi Arabia. I mean, we talk about the possibility of normalization, and nobody would say that Saudi Arabia has been guiltless of acts of terror, to say the least, over the years. So this is part of the realpolitik that countries deal with, for better and for worse. So in Israel right now, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur were under lockdown again. There has been a resurgence of COVID. And would you say that people are like, well, okay, this is terrible, but thank goodness we have normalization with the UAE? I mean, so it's like the sort of, the person on the street, I mean, how are people right now thinking of the situation of Israel, thinking of their represented leaders in what is arguably one of the most difficult, COVID situations worldwide right now?
Look, if I'm being perfectly frank, I think the average Israeli on the street doesn't care that much about the UAE right now. If you ask them about it, they'll say it's a good thing. Sure. If they get a phone call from a pollster asking them, they'll say it's a good thing, but it's like not even the 10th thing on their mind right now after, figuring out how to balance work with their kids being stuck at home all the time. And I realize for people in New York, that's just been the situation for 6 months straight. But in Israel, it was, we had our kids back in school in May, and now they're out of school again. People are very stressed, very concerned. We have a really, really high coronavirus rate. I believe it's the highest in the world per capita. Luckily, we have a relatively low rate of severe cases and a relatively low death rate. Which is probably a reflection of the fact that we have a young population relative to the Western world. But, it's a concern. This government that's like a unity government that's made up of parties that hate each other, basically. I mean, there's, no need to dress it up. Like they can't stand each other, and they're working really poorly together, and it's making it really hard for them to come up with a decent coronavirus response. So people are very unhappy. I love Israel, and I'm happy to live in Israel, so I hate making negative generalizations about the country. But as someone who grew up in America and compared to Israel, Israelis have a much greater expectation of the government to take care of things for them, as opposed to taking care of things themselves, which I suppose is the sort of leftover of the sort of socialist system that Israel had in its early decades. And I think that it's part of the crisis here. And I think people need to take greater personal responsibility, even while our government is not responding in the best way. Right. People are very down about the whole thing, though. Yeah. Understandable.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, in the United States, a lot of people are pretty down on the leadership as well. Sure. Whether the expectations are socialist derived or just that a government would take steps to try to protect its citizens and to follow science when a pandemic is raging. So that's something that a lot of Americans, I would say, are pretty upset about as well. Having no relation to a socialist type of expectation of being cared for.
Right. I guess part of the problem in Israel, I think, is that Israelis are used to bending the rules all the time. It's part of the Israeli chutzpah. It's part of what made Israel the startup nation, that people are willing to think outside the box. But it's making keeping the coronavirus rules maybe more of a challenge. Everyone's trying to figure out how to get around it and what excuse they'll give a cop at the roadblock and during a lockdown. And it's not great, and it's not the way to fight a pandemic. People here live in very close quarters, which makes it spread really fast between families, and there's a lot of, yeah, I don't have a hopeful message here. I hope we overcome it soon. I'm not really sure what will be.
Right. Absolutely. I think it is hard. I mean, you think about hopefulness. I mean, if there is anything, we'll come back to that at the very end, if there is anything hopeful. So I'll give you time to think about it because it's challenging right now to think about things that are hopeful.
Yeah.
Somebody did just ask the question, which you can, address up or down. Are Israelis comfortable with the Vice President Harris and the left wing of the Congress? So some of the
So I think
progressive
it's two different
Democratic
questions.
Congress people. Yeah,
I think,
I see them as two
yeah.
different ones, but they're bundled together.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah,
Kamala
I mean,
Harris Kamala Harris addressed AIPAC and in no uncertain terms was supportive
Right.
of Israel's right to exist, not questioning the legitimacy overtly. So I think with her specifically, I see
Yeah.
no reason why anybody would legitimately have issue. I would not put her in the same sentence as Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, but anyway, feel free.
Yeah, and I think she doesn't have a very long congressional voting record, but the record has been positive when it comes to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I think that she's mostly an unknown quantity in Israel. I would say
Sure.
When she officially became the vice presidential pick, I wanted to talk to politicians or government officials who had worked with her. And it was a challenge, and I basically only found one person, and that was our opposition leader, Yair Lapid. He had met with her. He had positive things to say about her, but he didn't want to go on the record because he didn't want to seem partisan, taking one side in the election. So she's really an unknown quantity here. I don't think people are worried about her necessarily, but she's not someone who, at least that high ups in the government know very well. As far as the squad, quote unquote,
Yes.
is concerned, they have overwhelmingly negative media coverage in Israel
Right.
Well, I think it's pretty similar to a lot of the American media, where they sort of inflate their value as whatever it is, 4 or 5 members of Congress out of many hundreds. So I think that happens here in the Israeli media too, especially because they often, or relatively often, talk about the topics that Israelis care about coming from Congress, which is, of course, Israel and Jews.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I think it depends. It's sort of like in the U.S. It depends what newspaper you're reading and what TV shows you're watching. Some will say, the Democratic Party is lost and there's no hope and it's all there. AOC is the future. And some will say, they're still a small minority, a vocal
Right.
minority, but it's still a minority at that.
Right.
And it depends what people are reading. I think, because of the steps that Trump has taken in the past couple of years, which have been popular in Israel, he's popular in Israel. But
Right.
like I had said before, I don't think anybody's too afraid of a Biden presidency here either.
Sure. No. I also, what you mentioned, I think the farther away you are, the less you are going to see the nuance. That's true of Americans vis-a-vis Israel. That's true of Israelis vis-a-vis the United States.
Yeah.
The congressional vote against BDS was approved overwhelmingly by Democrats and Republicans alike. And so this group is a very small minority, and people across the political spectrum, as we know, will sometimes inflate realities in order to perhaps for certain partisan purposes. So I think that happens in Israel as well as here. The final question that I have before anything hopeful that you want to share. So you made Aliyah when you were 17 and you grew up in New Jersey, in Deal, New Jersey. And my question to you is relations between Israeli and American Jews. What trends have you seen over the years since you have made Aliyah? Do you think that, there's a big concern that Jewish institutions have, synagogues, etc., that the younger generations they're in Israel and they're less connected to each other. There's less of that visceral and ideological sense of kesher, connection. So what's your sense? Because I think this is a very big question actually in terms of the connections between American and Israeli Jewry moving forward. What have you noticed over these past years?
I think that this is a huge question that a lot of American Jewish organizations are reckoning with, and a certain number of Israeli organizations are also dealing with it. But the Israeli population, for the most part, is barely aware of and doesn't think about. And on the Israeli side, that's part of the problem, that I think a lot of Israelis don't think that much about diaspora Jewry unless it's their direct relatives, or if there's like an anti-Semitic attack that happens somewhere, then it's like top of the news. And so they don't have that much to relate to or that much that they know. You know, I know my family, since we made Aliyah, anytime we visit Europe, we tend to want to see a synagogue. You know, we want to know what Jewish life is like in that town, but I don't think that the average Israeli family does that, just as an example. I don't think that's what interests them in their tours in Europe most of the time. And I think on the American side, Americans have this sort of fantasy idea of what Israel is, that doesn't always relate to reality. I think, you know, the majority of American Jews have never been to Israel. I mean, maybe birthright is, you know, chipping away at that, but, you know, it's still true that most Jews have not been to Israel and maybe don't really know Israelis that well. I don't think Great Neck is a representative community.
Probably not.
In this sense, from what I know of Great Neck.
Right.
But overall in the United States. And they don't realize, here's another way that Great Neck is not representative, that you know, most of the Jews in Israel are not, you know, from Russia or Poland or Germany. Most Jews in Israel are Mizrahi Jews that come from a sort of different cultural background and sensibility than most American Jews. And certainly are not, you know, white settler colonialists or whatever people who want to pretend that Israel is not legitimate like to say. You know, they've been in the region Jews have been in the region for thousands of years. It's where our roots are, and it's where most Israeli Jews have always come from.
Right.
You know, so I just, and there's also just a different reality where in the US for a long time now, I mean, we have these concerns about anti-Semitism that have been coming up in the past, I believe it was 6 years ago or so, where the tide started to turn and there started to be a rise in anti-Semitism in the US. You know, but for most of the time you had a reality where, not most of the time, but I don't know, for 50 years or so, you had a reality where most American Jews were not so worried about those things. And then you have Israelis who, for most of Israel's existence, have had to worry about existential threats. Yeah. And just a very different idea of what it means to be a Jew and what Jewish life is like and what it's about. You know, that's beyond the political reality of.
Absolutely.
I would also say, you know, like in Israel, sort of Judaism tends to be very traditional, and in the US, right, the biggest movement, I guess the biggest number is people are not affiliated with any movement. In the US, the big number is the Reform movement, which is very far into most Israelis. Right. You know, I don't know that necessarily most Israelis are against it per se, but it's just very, very far into them. I think, you know, the conservative synagogues being the sort of middle ground, or maybe Israelis would be more comfortable there, but, you know, certain, I would say, political emphases in Jewish communities, as opposed to, you know, where in Israel synagogues are a lot more just a place where you go to pray, and sometimes you see your friends there, but they're not the center of communal life necessarily. It's just a very different life. Absolutely. And so I'm rambling a little bit, but to get on track,
no, but I'll tell you, here's what I sense though. I think that what is so important is what many Israeli educational organizations call high resolution, that we try to actually get to know each other in a subtle way. Not all Israelis look alike. Not all Israelis have the same politics. Not all American Jews look alike, etc. And so when we brought a group of 50 teenagers to Israel, and we spent 10 days there, so we made sure we wanted them to meet with Israelis and with Arab Israeli citizens, and with people across the political spectrum, and to see that Israel isn't just the Kotel, but it's not just these holy sites, but it's also a living and breathing and complicated place. And I know that when Israelis come to the United States, and then when they're involved with federations, I think it's at least as valuable for them as it is for the communities which benefit, because they get to see American Jewry in its complexity. So that's important. So Lahav,
and I think a lot of Israelis. No, I think there's not all Israelis, but some Israelis, secular Israelis who come to America, whether they're doing, a postdoctorate or they got a job in the States or something like that, they, for the first time, sort of feel what it means to be Jewish as opposed to Israeli, because in Israel, it's just part of life. Like, Shavuot comes along and there's sales on dairy products and displays of dairy products in the supermarkets. Right. Everyone eats dairy on Shavuot. Everyone makes a cheesecake. Whereas in the US, I don't know that most Jews know what Shavuot is, right. And I hope they do, but I'm not entirely sure. Right. And so it's just like part of your life. And suddenly, these people have to start putting an emphasis on Judaism if they want to keep it up and they want their children to understand what it means. And then they have to get right. involved in a community. And it's just a completely different way of living a Jewish life.
And I'll add that when we have had Israeli students come here, we had actually Israeli students come from a conservatory, which was just wonderful. And they came and they spent Shabbat. And so there was just some female students who they experienced Kabbalat Shabbat, and they appreciated that men and women were sitting together and some women were leading the tefillah. And so at the end, they said, wow, there's nothing like this for us in Israel. This was kind of neat. So it's just interesting that, that there are things, obviously, that American Jews
exist in Israel. They just don't look for it.
Of course. I said to them, there are places where it exists, but they were high school students and it didn't exist right. for them. Right. And so understood. So the last thing, so you've obviously been sharing so much, but you had some time to think about something hopeful. So right now, if you could say from the perspective of Israeli society, just a sentence or two about what gives you hope for Israeli society, for the region moving forward. If it has repercussions beyond, extra credit.
Look, when I said I couldn't think of anything hopeful to say, it was about coronavirus. I think
course.
Overall,
admittedly, that's a challenge.
Right. We've hit a bump on the road with this coronavirus thing, and I think everywhere Absolutely. Around the world is it's a challenge, and it's also an economic challenge. But I think overall, Israel is, before coronavirus, we had never been in a better situation. We never had relations with more countries around the world. Our economy was very strong. And so I'm very optimistic and actually very hopeful about where Israel's going. And I think society too, look, Israelis love to argue. Jews love to argue, but Israelis love to argue as well. And, so we do hear about sort of strife between different population groups in Israel. But I think at the end of the day, people connect over, wanting to live their lives. People work together. People study together in universities. And I think that when you make those true real life connections, and people are making those kinds of connections in Israel every day when we're not locked down in our homes, those real life connections are the ones that make me hopeful and the ones that I think will build our future and not politicians shouting at each other in the Knesset.
Amen. Well, this is certainly a time, unfortunately, of enforced distancing, which our species is not meant to respond highly and well to. But at the same time, what you're pointing to at the end and what this whole conversation really is about is the opposite of distancing, which is connecting. And certainly for Israel to begin to find more allies, I think is a very positive thing. I'm hopeful that conversations, negotiations with Palestinians will continue to move forward as hopefully new generations of leaders take a more positive role. And I certainly hope that there will be connections between American and Israeli Jews, just as we begin to discover each other more and more. So just in that spirit of kasher, politically, socially, humanly, I think it's also a very good theme, hopefully, for Yom Kippur. So thank you so much, Lahav, for taking this time. I know it's late for you, and it's been a very long day for you, but I so appreciate, and I know the community really appreciates your sharing your eyewitness accounts and also your very deep expertise about all of these issues and the context. So thank you so much.
Cool.
And
thank you for inviting me, and I want to wish everyone a Gmar Chatima Tova and a Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Thank you, Lahav. Okay, everybody, this concludes the Jack Stein Memorial Symposium. Thanks so much for joining us. Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova.